And let's talk about the legal aspects of this. So, Paul Butler, first to you. The legal implications for Hunter Biden in ignoring a subpoena. And I misspoke earlier because Jim Jordan ignored the subpoena from the January 6th impeachment committee, but they didn't refer it to DOJ, so he never was in contempt. But he could be held in contempt. They could refer it to the Justice Department.
That's totally what could happen. So the House sometimes has closed-door depositions before it presents a witness in open court. The House January 6th committee did that with many of its witnesses. So if you're subpoenaed by Congress, you kind of have to show up, or you could be held in contempt. The question is, will there actually be consequences? So what would have to happen is that the House Oversight Committee would have to vote for a certificate of contempt. That certificate would then have to be approved by a majority of the House. Then the House would have to refer that to the United States Attorney for the District of Columbia. And since 2008, the U.S. Attorney for D.C. has received 10 of those referrals from the House. He's only prosecuted 2. He or she is only prosecuted 2. So the odds are, even if Hunter Biden doesn't have a defense to not showing up, which he apparently does not, it's unlikely that ultimately he'll face legal consequences.
And Mark Meadows never did, so they have taken very interesting reactions, responses.
Yeah, interestingly, Steve Bannon, he was convicted. He was sentenced to 4 months, and he's awaiting review of that. He could end up serving 4 months for contempt of Congress.
And Anthony, let's talk about the larger issue of impeachment, because we've seen no evidence. They haven't been able to provide any evidence connecting Joe Biden to his son's businesses. And impeachment is supposed to be high crimes and misdemeanors by the President of the United States, not something that his son did.
That's exactly right. Before I get to impeachment, let me talk about Hunter Biden here.
Sure.
What he did today was aggressive, he and his lawyers. It was an aggressive move. It was also the right move. I would note here that House Republicans have a history of cherry-picking things, said in private and then releasing them publicly.
Like the video of January 6th.
Without context, right? Without context, all in an effort to shape a public narrative. And so it was very wise for Hunter Biden to say, if I'm going to testify, I'm going to do so under the bright lights of transparency. I'm going to let the public decide for themselves what the reality is. Now, to the larger issue of impeachment, this is a vivid example of government overreach, Andrew. I would argue with one of the most narrow majorities in Congress. House Republicans would be better served by focusing on issues that people say they care about, like reducing health care costs, right? About addressing gun violence. Instead, they have chosen this more narrow option of trying to appeal and rally to a base that still believes to this day in the big lie that this election was stolen, which it was not. And so I would argue that, yeah, they're going to have some success in rallying their base, yes, but the issue of appealing to the broader electorate of Democrats and Republicans and independents, they're not going to be successful in that effort.
Well, one point I would make is that the politics of this are they could then say that the twice impeached former President Donald Trump is no different from the current president. He's under impeachment inquiry. So it helps them reshape the narrative in a campaign, which is terribly important to them. I should also point out that when you look at the children or relatives of presidents of the United States, we've got a lot of history here, going all the way back to just about every president that you've ever covered. Nixon, Carter, all of them had a sibling or some relative that was under some suspicion. And the fact that Jared Kushner has a reported $2 billion hedge fund that was negotiated while he was still a White House aide.
Right.
Because on January 6th, he happened to be in the Persian Gulf, and they announced that hedge fund commitment in late January, right after the inaugural, in February, to someone who'd never been in the hedge fund business before, was a real estate developer.
Yeah, I would hope that my colleagues,
that's
right, I would hope that my colleagues at the Justice Department are looking into that. They don't always tell us what they're investigating, but that is certainly based on public reporting. That is absolutely something that, at the very least, deserves their attention.
Paul Butler?
Hunter And Hunter Biden is under indictment in 2 federal courts. He's been quite transparent about his struggles with addiction and his criminal acts. The 2 indictments say squat about President Joe Biden. The constitutional standard for impeachment is high crimes and misdemeanors. The House has had a committee looking at Biden for months now, actually 2 committees. They haven't come up with anything approaching the constitutional standard. What they have come up with is a bunch of letters, which are apparently Hunter Biden paying back his dad and his uncle money that he owes them.
Well, let me just add that finally, James Comer, the Oversight Chairman, and the Judiciary Chair, Jim Jordan, have spoken to reporters after all of this happened and said that they are going to look into his failure to show, quote, "We expect to depose the president's son. We will then be more than happy to have a public hearing with him," Comer said. Well, we know that position. And Jordan said there's a process. When asked about contempt, there's a process you have to follow. You have to file reports. We will begin looking at that. Both lawyers for the Oversight Committee, the lawyers for the Judiciary Committee will move in that direction toward contempt. So that's another potentially criminal proceeding once the referral goes up.
Yeah.
And we have to also point out that the indictment, the tax case against Hunter Biden was just stunning in all of its implications. You could argue whether or not that should have been brought against him, which his attorneys can argue, but just the political impact of the gritty details in that are something that they're going to have to deal with during a presidential campaign.